They knew that this wasn't appropriate. The Surgeon General even said we couldn't do this in the United States.
We took people who were healthy and intentionally gave them this disease without them ever knowing.
The New York Times reports, quote, when some of the men failed to become infected through sex, the bacteria were poured into scrapes made on the penises or faces or even injected by spinal puncture.
In the mid-1940s, a U.S. government research team led by Dr. John Cutler conducted human experiments in Guatemala. They intentionally infected approximately 1,500 healthy Guatemalans with syphilis and gonorrhea in an experiment to test the effectiveness of penicillin on STDs. 83 people died during these experiments.
Y me acostaron en una camilla. Entonces un doctor estaba de este lado y el otro y la enfermera me tenía agarrada la cabeza. Entonces ellos hicieron por abrirme las piernas, ¿verdad? Y yo no quería. Entonces yo como niña de 10 años con sus fuerzas que podía tener, ¿verdad? Yo no quería y no quería, y yo hacía lo posible porque no. Entonces ellos decían no se puede, no se puede. Pero ellos me abrieron las piernas y me hicieron ese examen en mis partes, pues. Y me metían los dedos con algodón. Y iba de meterlos y yo lloraba pues porque una niña pues me dolía, ¿no?
Researchers intentionally chose prisoners, psychiatric patients, drafted soldiers, orphans, and prostitutes to be the subjects of these experiments. These groups are considered some of the most vulnerable members of any society because they are often poor, uneducated, and politically powerless. Their location in geographically constrained institutions, like prisons and penitentiaries, made these groups more vulnerable because they were hidden from the public eye and unable to leave of their own will. Their location in Guatemala also increased their vulnerability because the Guatemalan government did not create safeguards for these communities and even consented to their use in these experiments. The researchers specifically chose these populations because they could not protect themselves and had nobody to represent their interests. Racial bias against indigenous peoples only widened the power disparities between the vulnerable populations and the researchers. Once researchers realized that the Guatemalan prisoners they would be experimenting on were indigenous peoples, they decided, our payment for the males will be considerably less than we had originally planned. Racism also contributed to the lack of informed consent in the experiments.
Almost immediately upon arriving in Guatemala, Dr. Cutler, so there's a letter from Dr. Cutler to Dr. Arnold, and it reads that with the Indians in the prison, we may well do our work with little or no explanation, as they are only confused by explanations and knowing what is happening. So not only were they not receiving consent, but they're also saying, but it's okay, because we would just confuse them, so we're really doing what's best for them.
Western countries intentionally conduct medical research in developing countries for several reasons. There's less regulation, they are less likely to face lawsuits, and there are large populations of people living in poverty. Developing governments allow and even support medical experiments for several reasons. First, researchers in developing countries rarely have enough funding to conduct medical research unless they partner with Western countries. Also, developing countries often lack healthcare infrastructure, so in some cases, medical studies are viewed as the only way to receive healthcare. These power dynamics are fraught with ethical issues. In the Guatemalan syphilis case, the victims were not informed, did not provide consent, were intentionally infected with a disease they did not previously have, and did not receive treatment.
But I think because these people were Guatemalan and the government knew that it had a pretty good immunity defense, so they didn't look at it from a standpoint of compassion. They looked at it from a standpoint of, could we win this or not? And I think they did sort of count on the public not caring about these people because they were from Guatemala.
This case brings up the role that place, borders, and boundaries play in our world. Why was Guatemala chosen for the experiments? First, the U.S. government knew that legal protections and potential remedies for victims were much lower in Guatemala than they were in the U.S. Second, if we look to the geopolitics at the time, the Guatemalan government was under significant political pressure to agree to this study. In 1944, Guatemala had just entered its democratic spring, with a popular uprising that led to the election of Juan José Arevalo, who wanted to institute land reforms to give land back to the indigenous people. These proposed land reforms put Guatemala on shaky ground with the United States, whose economic interests were at stake. Given the geopolitics of the time, there was significant pressure on the Guatemalan government to agree to the experiments. The fact that the U.S. government overthrew the Guatemalan government just a decade later shows how much power the U.S. government had over the Guatemalan government, showing that agreeing to the experiments was hardly a choice.
And what are their defenses? Statute of limitations, procedural stuff? How can they substantially defend against this?
If you look at the defenses, it's almost like a Lincoln Logs, the way everything sort of fits together just right so that you can't reach the government the way they're arguing things. First of all, they're arguing that they should be substituted under the Westfall Act for any individual defendants. And so on the theory that these defendants, the individual doctors, were acting within the scope of employment. And that from the very get-go. I mean, there's a big question mark there. Can you say that intentionally infecting people with venereal diseases really truly was within the scope of employment? And we naturally argue it was not. But then when you substitute the U.S. government, you're then proceeding under the Federal Tort Claims Act. And in some, you can only sue the U.S. government when the U.S. government gives you permission to do so.
Fairly, I don't want to discourage them. I hope that they can move forward. The causation issue there is going to be pretty tough. Unless you could show that some other private actor really was the bad actor and that the U.S. government was just a tangential player, then causation would be there. But it's hard to say that's the case here.
Johns Hopkins University says it did not initiate, pay for, or conduct this experiment.
Doctors who were employees of Johns Hopkins went to the NIH and served on NIH committees, study committees, in their capacity on behalf of the federal government, but not on behalf of Johns Hopkins.